Welcome to the Psychology World podcast. I'm Connor Whiteley, bringing you psychology news, articles, and other interesting psychology-related articles. Where I can find the podcast notes and more interesting psychology-related things, and you can get your free 8 psychology book box set at connorwhiteley.net. Now let's get on to the show.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 170 of the Psychology World podcast with me, Con Whiteley, and today's episode is on what to look for when looking for a therapist. And even though the podcast's main audience is for psychology students and psychology professionals, this is still a really great and very useful episode for all of you and for non-psychology people too, though, as this is a great episode for everyone, simply because even though we are like psychologists and we are psychology students, and most of these subfields specialise in mental health and making sure that we are okay personally, well, our mental health can still suffer, and this is why it's really important whether we realise that it is okay to ask for help. And just because we work in psychology, it doesn't mean that we're immune to psychological distress and mental health difficulties, though. So, in case you're ever like this, then this is why it's important to know what you're looking for in a therapist. And it's also quite interesting to actually see it from our clients' point of views, though, because just like them, this is something that we will also look at, and these are the sort of signs that we would be looking at if we ever went to see a therapist. So with this podcast episode also just helps to a bit of a perspective from what our clients deal with. So that's coming up in the content part of today's episode, and it is Friday the 16th of September 2022 as I record this. So we're moving on to the psychology news section. We've reading from the British Psychological Society Research Digest, and there's only 2 today. So the first one is, learning a musical instrument may confer lifelong cognitive beliefs. Musical training has long been linked to better general cognitive functioning. Studies in investigating everything from the cognition skills of adult musicians versus non-musicians to the effect of instrument lessons on children's cognition has come out in support of the idea. However, relatively few studies have explored whether the benefits last. If, as a child, you have piano lessons, for example, does this have any impact on your cognitive abilities in later life? Results of a new longitudinal study in psychological science, which tested the same people at the ages of 11 and 70, suggest it does. Cognitive benefits of the musical training seems to be evident even decades later. So, but this is actually a rather good one, because the musical instruments, I think I tried to learn the drum set when I was a kid. I know I tried the French horn for a few years, and believe me, I do not do music well though. My mind just does not go in any musical inclination whatsoever. And yeah, I'm just absolutely useless when it comes to music there. But I do know that lots of people do enjoy it, and some people are really, really good at it though. So if you are musically inclined, then maybe definitely go for it and explore it there, because there are clear cognitive benefits. And the second one is, eating disorder rates vary amongst different groups of transgender and gender diverse people. Eating disorders are frequently conceptualized and talked about along gender lines. Women are more likely to be diagnosed with anorexia or bulimia, whilst men are more likely to face a stigma and go undiagnosed. However, these discussions largely focus on cisgender people. Cisgender people, those who identify with the gender they were assigned at birth. Yet many trans and gender diverse people also experience eating disorders, and there is also variance within these groups that largely goes unnoticed. A new study published in Annals of Epidemiology looks at eating disorder risks and diagnoses across transgender and gender diverse students in the US. The team finds a significant variability within the broad group of people, and those with certain gender identities and sexualities are more at risk of eating disorders than others. So, because my knowledge of eating disorders in general are actually quite limited on purpose, but that's for personal reasons. I actually want to make a slightly larger point about all of this, because that is one of the problems at the moment with psychological research, is that it's very much, the samples are sort of a rather set. For example, like we are all familiar with the weird sample bias, which is when psychology researchers and their results tend to be based on participants from Western industrialized democratic, I can never remember the R, and democratic countries. I can never ever remember what the R stands for. And that's already a problem though, but because it really does affect the generalizability of the results to other cultures, and even within our own cultures, I think. But it's actually quite interesting to look at that article about transgender and gender diverse people from the issue of sample bias though, because of course, many of our research results would not really matter, and they actually wouldn't be that different, as far as I know, if they were used non-cisgender people, that were, for example, conformity, basically anything from biological psychology probably, and quite a lot of the cognitive psychology stuff, to some extent, I would say. That wouldn't be any different though, but from clinical psychology point of view, most of that research is all based on straight, white, middle-class men and women. Of course, there's nothing wrong with those groups whatsoever. But when it comes to the research literature, it does need to be a bit more diverse there, because of course we know tons about the oppression in a white and middle class of people. But if you start to go towards the edges of the literature, there isn't quite as much mentioned on depression in transgender people, etc., in on a person. So it's all quite interesting, and the article is a useful reminder to sometimes that we do need to do research with these smaller minority groups. So I hope you enjoyed the psychology news section. So let's move on to the personal update. So we're moving on to the personal update. So with this one, I should actually be quite a short one, because there's there's just been so much it's bits into pieces. Well, most of it is non-psychology based. I've been doing lots of research on the psychology of deception, or deception, and that is quite interesting because it really does flip quite a lot of the traditional assumptions of forensic psychology on its head. That's absolutely fascinating. And then I've also been doing quite a lot of university stuff, and just so many little bits and pieces that but next week I am looking forward to, because I'll be going back to university, because it's a welcome week, but I've got some outreach work, work that I'm doing. I've got university social for my final year project, and the people who I'm doing that with. So that's just going to be a really good week, all we're told. And now I'm involved in this pilot study, it turns out. because I signed up for it earlier. But what I did want to say though is that I really hope that the podcast sounds a little slower as such, though, because I know because on YouTube, and I think lots of people think this anyway, but it's just some of the YouTube comments which I seldom read because I tend to find those negative comments about the speed of the podcast sometimes quite disheartening because I do try and talk slower sometimes, but sometimes when I'm talking normally, I do talk a bit fast, and then it's made even worse by when I get excited though. So yes, so I finally found on the audio editing software that I do how to slow it down, digitally. So hopefully that sounds fine, and hopefully it's a slight improvement. But I'm the worst judge whatsoever because whenever I listen to a podcast or audio only videos, I always tend to listen to stuff at 2 times speed because that's what my brain's used to now. So anything slower sounds awful. So even though I've slowed it down only slightly, it sounds absolutely awful to me. So I have no idea though. So I guess in a few weeks though, after a month of experimenting with this, I'll see what's happened to the podcast. But if you prefer it, or if it is working, and if it doesn't sound terrible, then please let me know. Please email me. So, as always, I always love to hear your thoughts and feelings on today's episode. So, you can always email me, connorwhiteley@connorwhiteley.net. You can always leave a comment in the show notes at connorwhiteley.net/podcast. And you can always tweet me on Twitter at sci-fi Whiteley. I always love to hear from all of you because it really helps make the podcast feel more like a conversation. And today's episode has been sponsored by my clinical psychology collection. So this is an absolutely brilliant bundle and a box set that can really help you expand your knowledge of clinical psychology, mental health, and abnormal psychology to a brand new front step. Because this collection includes my clinical psychology book, which is a great, really helpful, easy to understand guide that really helps you to understand the foundation and the basics of clinical psychology. So if you're new to the topic, or even if you just want a refresher before you go back to university, then this is a really helpful book to you. It also includes my formulation in psychotherapy, which I have to admit is one of my absolute favourite books because it's an outstanding book that really helps you to look at a formulation in psychotherapy, which is where mental health treatment should be going, because it's all about tailor-making the mental health intervention to that individual specific. Instead of automatically saying that you've got depression, so but you need CBT, formulation is all about looking at that individual and seeing what works for them, and not necessarily what just works for their label. So that is one of my favourite books, and it is just simply brilliant. And then the last book in the collection is my abnormal psychology book, which is always a popular book because it looks at the causes and treatments for depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, and so many more great conditions. So if you wanted to expand your knowledge about any of these topics, then definitely get it all. And one of my favourite benefits about bundles is that they are a lot cheaper than buying the books individually. So that's definitely a bonus. So if that's interested you, then please check out Clinical Psychology Collection, available from all major ebook retailers, and you can get the paperback and the hardback version from Amazon, your local bookstore, or local library if you request it. But if you didn't want to buy a book, be someone need to give the podcast a one-time support, then you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Connor Whiteley. And you were buying books and you buying me coffees that really help support the podcast and my time in writing up the blog post, recording the podcast and editing it, which does take a lot of time, but I do love it. So now that that's done, let's move on to the content part of today's episode. So moving on to the content part of today's episode, we're going to be talking about what to know when looking for a therapist. And because I've already spoken about this in the introduction, I'm actually just going to dive into the post today. Why do we need to know what to look for when looking for a therapist? To elaborate on what I put in the introduction, as psychology students and professionals, there are a lot of different tough decisions we need to make. Students need to make good choices so that they have a good foundation for their career and knowledge base in pursuit of a career in psychology, as well as psychologists make tough decisions about their clients' interventions and treatment courses. Therefore, these stresses and other factors can add up over time to decrease mental health in a person. If they're sad or worried, then it can affect their performance and ability to function in everyday life, so acting fast and getting professional help is critical. Additionally, as psychology students and professionals, we're all familiar with cognitive behavioural therapy. That is the gold standard for a wide range of conditions, including depression from Beck, 1964, and anxiety and other behavioural problems, even though modern clinical psychology doesn't like that term. David and all, 2018. As well as chances are we would most of us would seek out a cognitive behavioural therapist, at least first of all, if we needed psychological help. However, just in case there are any listeners that aren't overly familiar with CBT or want a refresher, here's some basics. CBT is defined as a conceptual model, Beck and all, 2001. And the psychologists practicing CBT conduct themselves according to the principles of guided discovery and collaborative empiricalism. Beckenall, 1979, with the therapy involving homework assignments and review, regular process monitoring, and eliciting client feedback, all being important features in each session. In addition, CBT techniques are properly applied in an experimental here and now way, so that treatment is focused on the present, not the past. This is helpful because it focuses on your present concerns at this moment in a time, instead of dismissing them. Freiberg and McClure, 2015. Lastly, practitioners of CBT apply a wide range of change-inducing techniques, for example, mindfulness, behavioral activation, social skills training, exposure, and cognitive restructuring, as well as exposure techniques are very important when it comes to treating anxiety disorders. But this raises the question for ourselves and our clients of how do we know that the psychotherapist is competent and effective at applying this flexible approach? Especially, and I'm sure the psychological professionals that can back me up here, but there are always some co-workers we see, and we suddenly question how they got professionally licensed in the first place, or to be honest, pass their PhD. Even though I'm in undergrad, I sort of see that all already. And I have met a few PhD students, And I think there's only one that made me question their commitment to clinical psychology. This is even more important to consider when Creedinal 2016 found that whilst many therapists said they faithfully followed CBT, some failed to follow the basic principles, so that they were basically using a fake type of CBT, for lack of a better term. 5 signs of a potentially effective CBT therapist. As a result, when it comes to interviewing a prospective therapist, and of course this is if you're going private, because in the public sector you tend to just be given one to the best of my knowledge, it's important to know where the sort of answers and information you will need to know if the therapist is a CBT therapist or not. Firstly, cognitive behavioural therapy is action-orientated. So where the vast majority of our therapists will set you self-help or homework assignment goals throughout the course of the therapy, because CBT is an active, goal-orientated treatment that might be short-term, but it gives you skills for the long-term. Now, I say the vast majority because one of my clinical psychology lecturers did do a CBT, but she often forgot to set it by accident. These assignments help you to use coping skills that you learnt about in the therapy and apply them to your everyday life by generalizing them. This is a critical part of the process. Secondly, cognitive behavioral therapy involves a lot of collaboration with you and the therapist effectively co-designing the treatment plan, since in the first few sessions your therapist will interview you by conducting an assessment, and they'll ask questions about the symptoms' intensity, duration, frequency, and interference with everyday life. Then, after you get a diagnosis, you and the therapist will collaboratively discuss a treatment plan and estimate a treatment timeframe, giving you the opportunity to ask questions and actively participate in the treatment. Which is why I prefer these sort of more open forms of therapy, with the therapeutic alliance playing more of an active role, because I tend to think that this seems fairer on the client at the end of the day, especially as I will always remember what my lecturer said. We are the experts in the knowledge and theory, the client is the expert in themselves. These more collaborative therapies definitely make that truer. Thirdly, the therapy session of a CBT focus on helping a person to challenge their thoughts and activate their behaviour. Therefore, if you're wondering how you would deal with these maladaptive coping mechanisms and negative emotions, most therapists will tell you that you can manage your distress by facing your fears and anxieties, as well as you can learn to tolerate these negative emotions by active coping and learning to approach and accept previously avoided situations, feelings and thoughts. But all of that would of course be examined in more detail in a therapy session. Penultimately, the agenda of the session is always set at the beginning of the meeting, because psychology is very precise and no therapy session is ever chaotically done. There is always a plan. And to counter a common myth here, and this is more for any non-psychology readers here, instead of you lying on a couch venting about past problems, your therapist will discuss and plan out the agenda of the session within the first few minutes of every session. With last week's homework being reviewed, you were prioritising the agenda items, and a plan for addressing the difficulties that you face are collaboratively done. Finally, symptoms are tracked to make sure that there is a progress in CBT. Due to assessment measurements, track your progress throughout the treatment, and qualitative reports like your beliefs about your progress, and quantitative reports, symptomatic measures, and guide treatment plannings are used too. These trackers are really useful in their therapy because they help the therapist to know what's working and if they need to pivot their plan because something is or isn't working for you as the client. That's why CBT must always be flexible. Conclusion. Personally, whilst this episode really did end up serving two audiences, the podcast's main audience of amazing psychology students and professionals, because it helps to understand the sort of things that our clients need to understand and what they expect from us, and it helps psychology students to improve their understanding of the CBT, as well as the episode would have helped non-psychology people understand therapy better too. But there is another point to this episode. I want to remind us all as psychology students and professionals that just because we study and work in a profession that specialises in mental health as one of its many subfields, it doesn't mean we are immune to decreases in mental health and mental health difficulties. So this is an unofficial reminder to always seek out professional help if you are struggling, and get support from friends and family as well. Never suffer in silence. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode and that you got something out of it. I really like these sort of mental health podcast episodes. So when I saw the research and the inspiration behind today's episode, I literally just had to grab it, and I literally just had to do it. And if you know someone who will enjoy today's episode, then please share it with them. I'm always really grateful when you wonderful people help spread the words about the podcast. And definitely check out Clinical Psychology Collection, available in all the usual places. But if you didn't want to buy a book, but you still wanted to give the podcast a bit of one-time support, then definitely buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Con Whiteley. So have a great day, everyone, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to see the show notes, then please go to connorwhiteley.net. And if you want a free 8-book psychology box set, then please go to connorwhiteley.net. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.